Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this premiere edition of Inside Out with Natasha and Francesca. I'm Francesca Maxime, a certified mindfulness teacher and somatic experiencing practitioner, and have been digging into the anti-racism work that is so relevant in today's world, but has been forever since the founding of this country. And I'm joined with my friend and the author of Whiteness on the Couch, Dr. Natasha Stovall, the co-host of the show. Hey, Natasha.
Hey, Francesca. It's great to be here, and I'm really looking forward to having some of these uncomfortable conversations that we keep talking about having, but haven't quite been having as much as we need to.
That's right. That's right. And I think that this is definitely, it's funny because we had our first initial conversation and, connection, if you will, when you wrote that article, because I had been working in the anti-racism space, or at least trying to be on the anti-racist path, I should say, because really it's just an evolution for me in terms of understanding new things that I didn't know before and how to work with people about that, but also how I work with myself on that. And then I read your article, Whiteness on the Couch, and you really talked about bringing racism, white body supremacy, interrogating whiteness into the therapy room with clients. How do psychologists, clinicians, therapists, how do you do that? And I thought it was really compelling and helped a lot of people. And so here we are today now. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? Just sort of why you sort of wrote that and how that's relevant for today and for our show today.
Yeah, I guess when I think about my own experience, like as a white woman living in America, growing up in a white family, a very liberal white family where race was something that was talked about a lot, but there was very little understanding of like how we as white people would recreate this, the American situation that Eduardo Bonilla Silva calls racism without racists. Once I went into becoming the process of becoming a psychologist, I really got curious, like how is it that like white people recreate this even when they don't want to? Like how much of it is unconscious, how much of it is conscious? Like I just got curious about the mechanics of it. And then once I started working in private practice with mostly white clients and realizing that like race was something that rarely came up except in like these crisis moments like we're in right now, and even then would kind of like come up and then like slowly go back under the rug, so to speak. I really decided to like look into it in a more kind of organized and formal fashion. And what I found when I started to do research was there is a very, I guess I would call it like an anti-racist strain of psychology, social work, all different types of like wellness and healing practices. But it isn't something that's really very taught in a very organized fashion, or that most psychotherapists come into therapy sessions feeling prepared to talk to, especially white therapists working with white clients. But even therapists who are people of color working with white clients feel like there's a lot of vagueness around what they feel like they have permission to talk to people about, what they should talk to people about. And yet there's a lot of burden on therapists of color to kind of come up with answers, especially from their, questions that their white patients have. So I feel like this is a really necessary conversation in our field. And so I'm glad that we're going to have some of these conversations and sort of, do some,
some unpacking,
exploration. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that there's so much to what you said. I mean, for people who want to know my social location, it's she, her, hers. I'm cishet. I'm Haitian, Dominican, Italian, American woman of a certain age. And, but in white body supremacy culture, youth is valued, whiteness, blondness, sort of wealth, Christianity, Catholicism, all these things. And I'm on Lenape and Canarsie land here in Brooklyn that, is land that was taken and stolen from the indigenous ancestors, some of whom are still around. So, we have to sort of remember that this goes all the way back to genocide and goes to enslavement and kidnapping of people, and that's the labor and the capital on which this country has been founded. And that's why there's this talk about wealth redistribution and different kinds of equity, and that outer piece, if you will, in terms of policy and, the school to prison pipeline and abolishing prisons and, reforming schools and abolishing and defunding the police and all of that. But then there's also this internal piece, which is a little bit of the nuance that we're going to start to get into in terms of, just becoming more comfortable talking about racism, whiteness, white body supremacy, because whiteness, as Dr. Janet Helms talks about it, whom you know well, and I'll be interviewing tomorrow for my Rerooted podcast, which will be posted on the Be Here Now network soon.
So exciting.
Yeah, that, you know, she has been at the forefront of really interrogating the way in which this shows up, racism in a clinical setting, but that this idea of defining whiteness as almost a deficit, like there's nothing there, like because it's dominant, like we don't, there's like, whereas we look at people of color or people of culture, as Resmaa Menakem says, you know, we talk about the global majority as having more, like where that, you know, sort of a cultural appropriation can come in and stuff. And there's sort of this interest in and this leaning in toward, but race is always defined as Black and brown and Asian and indigenous and whatever. It's not really looked at and interrogated as whiteness, even though it's a construct, is a race itself. And it definitely invites and begs for our interrogation about that and what the concept of whiteness even is about, which is about oppression and supremacy.
I mean, absolutely everything that you just said. And I guess I'll just say, like, in terms of my own experience, like, and what brought me here today, that I come from a family on both sides of my family, my mother's family and my father's family, that was very much inside the white experience that you just described. Christian, settler, you know, like I think the most recent ancestor that came on my mother's side that I know of came in the mid 1800s. So these people in my family have been here. I'm descended directly from settlers in the Midwest, in the Northeast, and in the South, including people who owned slaves, including people who were indentured servants. And so the dynamics of the family that I am in are very much the dynamics that we see out in the world today, recreating all of the oppressive systems that you just named, and that are very much kind of like implicated and complicit with all of the atrocities, all of the past atrocities, the genocides, and, you know, that are the very foundations of the US, and also the things that are kind of currently happening, the dynamics that are very much, you know, alive and enacted every minute of every day. And what I started to get really curious about is ways in which in this family, especially the family that I grew up in, where both my parents were really active in the civil rights movement in their own ways, and really made a conscious effort to kind of push against white supremacy in their own ways. Like, given that they're in their 70s, my father passed away, he would have been 81 this year. You know, but in their own ways, they really were at the forefront, and their solution to kind of coming from these families where racism was even alive and well, or was kind of very much like really one generation removed, was to kind of just try to throw it all away, throw away all of the legacy, and to try to wipe the slate clean, and to kind of to kind of almost like reject all of the cultural baggage that they had, and then try to live in an anti-racist way. And it was so much more complicated than that. And what I got curious about was the ways that they replicated through their parenting, through their style of being, these kinds of structures of repression without intending to, unconsciously. And then, of course, because I was, you know, a therapist, and it's all about how do you deal with the unconscious process? How do you deal with the resistance to making changes that people want to make? It seems like such a parallel process to me.
Right.
You know, and then, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
Well, I was just going to say that, like, when I looked at psychology, I started to think about, like, well, this is so much of psychology, which is basically by and for and about white, Caucasian, Christian, well, not Christian, I mean, Christian and Jewish. But, you know, this kind of like family system, so to speak, is really about having a racial hierarchy. I mean, or just a hierarchy period, but especially a racial hierarchy, you know, cognitive dissonance, projection, you know, all the defense mechanisms. I mean, you can read the whole history of psychology as being about, you know, the oppression that we're trying to address. And I think that people have understood that over the years and try to bring it to the forefront. And there's been a lot of resistance in the field of mental health itself.
Yeah, and what I see is it's fine to talk about narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder. It's fine to talk about defensiveness. It's fine to talk about dissociation. And I don't necessarily mean DID, dissociative identity disorder, but just general dissociation. And it's fine to talk about things like shame or grandiosity, and it's fine to talk about things like power dynamics in a relationship or things like that. But when you take that model and you take that template and you insert it into race, the conversation about race, and you make explicit that there are opportunities that are either doled out or denied, or and structurally, like, I just want to make clear, we're talking about psychotherapy here, but we're also talking about the structural institutionalized systems that, from a mindfulness perspective, is the imprinting or the conditioning that over time, neurobiologically, physiologically, neurally, synaptically, subcortically, comes into your brain and your neural synaptic structures, that over time epigenetically also shows up in terms of all the things you're saying about your lineage and your ancestors and whatnot, and why you can't just wipe the slate clean. That there are certain things that, even though you can choose to be anti-racist in a moment, and that's important and we should, that sometimes doing these other pieces are also important. But one of the things that I want to say about this is that this piece of having the fields of psychotherapy sort of dance around this whole idea of grandiosity and shame, the haves and the have-nots, all these things of, oh, I feel voiceless in my family, nobody listens to me. Well, what about that is about white body supremacy and whiteness and oppression, like that.
Yeah.
Connecting the dots to the racial piece, meaning that that race is in service to this oppressive patriarchal structure, that there only can be winners if there are losers, and you can only be somewhere on the ladder. Whereas a more collectivist culture would say, okay, you're doing more today, or this other person is doing a little bit different here, or we need artists here, but we need data gatherers here, or whatever it is, that people have a more equitable role, and that this is about equity, and that people really kind of are frozen in this idea of thinking that we have to dissociate as therapists from bringing race into the conversation about dissociation and defensiveness and stonewalling and avoidance and all of that, which I just find fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in my article, I called it The Thing, because when I was in graduate school, I heard this thing about how, among, like therapists, it was sort of like a saying, like, if the thing that you're not talking about is the thing that is like blocking people from like a sort of a deeper transformational change, which I think you can say a lot about in terms of like how that relates to the neurobiology and the kind of like the way that people do make transformational change, which I think is really important. And I thought that was really interesting, because it's like, well, that's certainly something that we never talk about in therapy sessions, or rarely. I mean, it's not true universally. I mean, I think there are white therapists out there. Like, I didn't invent this, and there are therapists out there, white therapists of color, like therapists who are now in their 80s, who have been talking about this. So I'm not talking about like I just invented this, but in terms of the institutions of training and the institutions of like how what people come out generally with a degree and can expect when they finish their training or even go into a training. Like there is an avoidance of this topic, and it's avoided in general in the therapy room. And so like
the avoidance of whiteness, because race is talked about in terms of others, like, how do you serve, different populations, but not about whiteness.
Sure. Right. Like I guess the distinction you're making there is like, it's comfortable to talk about race as being something that people of color experience. And so like, if you're going to talk about race, you need to make sure that you kind of like understand it so that you don't like you do no harm in therapy sessions if your client
right
is
they call that cultural responsiveness or cultural
cultural competence,
right,
but the idea that you would need to have some kind of cultural competence, well, I guess it's two different things. Yeah, but that's kind of like not on the table. But also that, like, I mean, even questions of like, what do you do if someone brings prejudice content into the room? Like that you're not even prepared for that. So I guess that's the part that I think is like the most egregious sort of enactment around, like racism in therapy today. But like I'm saying, many people have addressed it and have tried to address it, but institutionally it's not addressed. Like there's a structural issue.
Right.
So people are kind of piecing it together on their own and trying to figure it out, and more like, but there's very little movement from like institutional bodies.
Well, pedagogically, like you're talking about the
Yeah.
analytic training centers or schools,
Mhm.
Adelphi,
Yeah.
NYU, whomever is teaching, Fordham,
Mhm.
whatever,
Yeah.
that how are we naming this and bringing this in? Because what I
Mhm.
see is that you see it in these different aspects, right? You'll see it at, the policy school or the government school. They'll be talking about
Mhm.
policy, right? And so it's
Mhm.
okay to talk about it there. Or you'll be talking about certain things like, law school cases or something.
Mhm.
But then like pulling it together in terms of how it is with us in
Yeah,
our
turning the
bodies.
lens. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's why we're calling the show Inside Out with Natasha and Francesca, because we're really, right? Isn't that why we are?
Yeah.
It's like, do
Yeah.
the U-turn first,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
forget about all that stuff out there, because who are
Mhm.
you? And as you were saying that, I'm thinking, well, they kind of teach it like countertransference, right? Like, oh,
Mhm.
but that's not really it, because it's not just you. It's the
Mhm.
institution that makes you have this kind of habit pattern or belief system that
Mhm.
we're all affected by.
Right. Well, like I guess as a white therapist, you are bringing whiteness. So the idea that like you wouldn't be bringing race into the room is a complete illusion. But that's not something you learn in your like your counter. I mean, there are like Dorothy Holmes, who's a psychoanalyst who at this point is probably in her late 70s and has been talking about this for the last 30 years. She wrote a paper in the 90s or possibly the 80s about race and countertransference and transference in psychoanalysis. So, like this is and as an African American therapist, she sort of, and the fact that she was writing this, or her training happened in the 70s, and so she was very much, a very politicized person, and she had her experience. So but she brought it, and she had to bring it to the field. Do you know what I mean? Like she
Right.
and other Black therapists brought, like Janet Helms. I mean, they're contemporaries, and so um, you know, it was left to therapists of color. And in that moment, it was mostly African American therapists to bring this material and say, oh, hey, by the way, like race is happening.
Well, all right,
I
let me
mean,
play. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah.
Finish your
Well,
thought.
the evolution has been like, and it's not just happening because we're here. It's always happening.
Right,
It's
right,
just
right,
only noticeable because we're here. Because
right.
otherwise you just avoid it and act like you're all good white liberals, because that's who this population of therapists is.
That's right, right, right. Yeah. That whole idea of, well, it's not my intention, or, I'm
Hmm.
non-racist, or I don't see color. I mean, we can
Yeah,
unpack the whole terminology around why color blindness doesn't work, which was the whole ideology for a long time
right,
about like, I don't see color, I treat everybody the same. And,
right. But these people weren't even colorblind. They were like people who, supported the civil rights movement. They were.
Sorry, I have a frog in my throat. Perfect time to do that, right? It's all right. We're rolling with it. I think it's incumbent on white people to interrogate whiteness and not continue to go to Black people, including
Yeah,
clients,
yeah.
about what they need to
Oh,
know,
the
or what do you
stories
want me
are
to say?
horrible.
I mean, that's the worst thing you can do. So, I think that's why we're sort of to have these conversations. We want people to like go and chat, like, ask questions in chat on Facebook, or if you're on YouTube, or if you're on Twitter, or if you're on whatever. I guess Brian, so Liberty, our producer, God bless him, is
Yeah, thank you,
streaming all
Brian.
over the place. So he's been great to partner with us at this. Put your questions in there if you want about what it is that you want to know. But I was thinking maybe we could use this as an opportunity to pivot to the video that we were talking about,
Hmm.
in terms of the celebrity mea culpas and what's wrong with that, and sort of what's going on. I think, do you want to roll it and then talk about it, or do you want to say anything about it before we roll it?
I think we should roll it because it does kind of speak for itself, but
All
you
right.
know,
Yeah, I mean, this is a bunch of white celebrities who are talking about, quote unquote, I take responsibility. It's a video that I think came out for the first time last week. And I saw it and I felt it was kind of cringeworthy, and shared it with Natasha. And we thought it might be a good example of people who are like those white liberal therapists, sort of maybe trying to do something good or something along those lines, but also how it kind of doesn't, it falls short. It might be a little tone deaf. So,
mhm.
Brian, if you don't mind bringing that up, that would be great. Thanks.
I take responsibility.
I take responsibility.
I take responsibility.
I take responsibility for every unchecked moment,
for every time it was easier to ignore than to call it out for what it was.
Every not so funny joke. Every unfair stereotype.
Every blatant injustice, no matter how big or small.
Every time I remained silent.
Every time I explained away police brutality or turned a blind eye.
I take responsibility. Black people are being slaughtered in the streets, killed in their own homes. These are our brothers and sisters,
our friends, our family. We are done watching them die. We are no longer bystanders. We will not be idle. Enough is enough.
I will no longer allow an unchecked moment. I will no longer allow racist, hurtful words, jokes, stereotypes, no matter how big or small, to be uttered in my presence.
I will not turn a blind eye.
Going for a jog should not be a death sentence. Sleeping in your own home should not be a death sentence.
Playing video games with your nephew should not be a death sentence.
Shopping in a store should not be a death sentence. Business as usual should not be life-threatening. I stand against hate.
I stand against hate.
I stand against hate.
I stand against hate.
I will stand against hate in love. I will make my presence known.
And killer cops must be prosecuted. They are murderers. We can turn the tide. It is time to take responsibility. Call out hate, step up, and take action.
There's so much there.
There's so much there, and you know, and I like some of those actors, right? And yeah. So, where do we want to begin with that?
Well, would you like to go or should I go?
Here, I guess I'll just mention it. Like, here's the thing. When I saw that, I was just like, who is this in service to? So from a mindfulness perspective, we always sort of look at what is our intent? And in sociology circles and in anti-racism circles, we talk about intent versus impact, meaning the oops and the ouch. Ooh, I misspoke. Ooh, I said something that was a microaggression. And then ouch, the accountability that you have to take on when somebody says that offended me and own it and not get stuck in a shame spiral, right? Now, these folks I'm feeling are a little bit about, okay, well, this is in service to me and assuaging my guilt or my white, you know, racial fragility, as opposed to necessarily like finding a way to be able to be an embodied anti-racist, which might also just mean sitting down and staying quiet and start really looking and reflecting at things in a way that is not quite so I don't know, just it felt to me like it was an attempt, but it was kind of disingenuous because they're not there yet. And I'm not saying that it has to be all perfect, but I'm also sort of feeling like, what was the intent there? Was it to make them feel better? Was it to make a public declaration so that they felt like they were going to be held accountable by their fans for all of their racist or microaggressions or something? Like, I didn't really understand how that was in direct service to Black and brown people or Indigenous folks. I just didn't really get that. And it just felt like it was a little bit more in service to them as celebrities to like be in the moment and be part of the conversation, as opposed to being like embodied about it.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I mean, I have thoughts about it, you know, sort of as a person and also as a therapist, and I'm going to stick with the therapist thoughts. But you know, for one thing, it seems like these people are sort of the front people for something. And I guess whatever the responsibility project and whoever conceptualized this and went to them with this ask of like, could you please participate in this as a way to do X, Y, Z, also bears a tremendous amount of responsibility for just this whole idea of like getting together and everybody saying, I take responsibility, is somehow going to be impactful in a way that goes beyond, you know, just something incredibly performative. I mean, the irony is that these people are actors, so their job is to perform. So they were sort of asked to perform in a way, and they did.
And I could see them reading.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing is that there's a tremendous amount of, and so I mentioned when we were doing the promo of like, why is it so hard to actually take responsibility versus just wanting to be seen taking responsibility?
Right.
And I think part of the problem with this is that there's so little content to it. It's like, I take responsibility, like it is literally words. I mean, the Stanley Tucci part where he says, you know, I will no longer stand silent while people make racist jokes. Like, okay, well, that's like an actual thing you could commit to doing. And then,
that's I think the difference between responsibility and accountability, because with accountability, you can name some kind of specific microaggression and say, when I did this in the board meeting, or when I did this on set, I am now accountable for that because I have an awareness of that, and that was wrong. And I take responsibility for that and pledge to never do it again. And that would have even felt different to me if they had done it that way on this video, as opposed to this blanket thing.
Well, and they are trying to get to, you know, like this idea of like how we all bear responsibility as white participants in white body supremacy. Like that if the police are murdering, you know, Black and brown people in service to their job as the police, then that is the responsibility of the people in the dominant culture who are enabling them, whether directly or indirectly, to have that power. And so like, it's true, we all need to take responsibility, but taking responsibility is not the same as saying I take responsibility. And so like, it has to be tied very tightly to actions that then correct the problem.
That's right.
You know, and so the idea of like, I'm not going to stand by when people make racist jokes, that's an action. And killer cops have to be prosecuted. That's like actionable, you know, at least. But all the rest of it is really just about like, kind of much more about like the surface of how I'm perceived or how I feel about myself versus like something I'm actually doing that's going to change the situation. Like, yeah, everyone feels bad. That's easy to feel bad. I mean, it's certainly important to feel bad versus to be like, yes, I totally support this, which is another whole slice of the white population.
And that kind of gets to this other piece of I'm standing with versus standing for. Like, I don't want someone to do something for me. It's the difference between like pity and active and embodied compassion. I don't want just blind empathy where you're stuck in the feeling bad piece, or, you know, someone pitying, saying, I'm going to do this for you, and this performative thing. So, I mean, yeah, if you're a billionaire and you want to give some money, I guess, but not just to assuage your soul, but because you are doing it because there's an inequity there that you're recognizing needs to be sort of balanced out at a certain level, but still looking inside and doing that inside work. So I guess it's that piece around like really being, as you say, what is it when I'm at, I won't even say Starbucks because I guess they backtracked on that. But, you know, they had that whole thing about the t-shirts where you're not supposed to be wearing the Black Lives Matter t-shirts, but now they said you can, which is a whole other thing. But that if they're, you know, seeing someone do a microaggression in line, for example, that Stanley Tucci is going to sit there and say, you know, I'm going to speak to the clerk when he's yelling at the person who's, you know, from, you know, speaking in Spanish or something. And I'm going to step in and say that. I'm going to put my body on the line. I'm going to make sure that I, you know, step in front of the cop. I'm going to do those kinds of things. And that is, it's a big ask for some people, I think.
Right. And I think that like the role of an institution like Starbucks is like, they can pay for everybody in their you know, employment to do bystander training so that they know what to do when something like this happens. And they can like, I mean, obviously they've done some of this around like having racist employees who are calling the police on customers. But, you know, there's still more work to be done. And I think it does get into this question of like, who is it in service to? Because, and what is it in service to? Because like some of these larger institutions really are in service to maintaining white supremacy. They kind of don't like the idea that that involves overt racism, but the idea of dismantling white supremacy for a lot of institutions, including ones that mental health is deeply involved in, and mental health is also involved in police work. So that's another part of our field that needs to be interrogated, you know, and how the field of mental health itself upholds white supremacy and descends from white supremacy. You know, like all of this is stuff that has to be interrogated and we'll be talking about in the coming weeks. But, you know, like, you know, when you're dealing with these kind of sort of like moments, you know, and you're thinking about how like mental health plays a role and how, you know, like Starbucks, for example, can address things or not address things, like what it's in service to really, it gets quite murky, because white supremacy is also like a part of it upholding capitalism, and it's always been about economics. So, I think as therapists, our specialty is really helping people understand like kind of the micro, like how does this live inside us, and how do we start to work on it in a way that we can have a more embodied presence, like we can actually land somewhere and stop being so confused about our role. But how that's going to work and what the ultimate outcome is, I think, is also still very up in the air, because our field has really spent so little time trying to understand like what is the relationship of our psychology and the field of psychology to white supremacy.
Right.
Like this external thing that we create.
Right. And to that end, a couple of things, like what is it that white therapists need to do that they're not doing and haven't been doing in terms of understanding the history, learning the actual history, taking some of these classes that I keep talking about, like drjoydegrue.com, or Joy DeGruy online. Post-traumatic slave syndrome is her book, or the whiteawake.org classes that you can take, or the People's Institute, or the Racial Equity Institute, and all of these things that are more like didactic, meaning that you will learn certain facts and figures that are horrible and horrifying. And you will also, perhaps, depending on how the group is run, do experiential exercises that can help you sort of hold the right brain limbic sort of subcortical embodied process of what does it feel like when it feels so awful and overwhelming. And some of the work that I do with clients and folks who are in my group on Wednesdays, actually it'll be later today in about 3 hours at 3:30, the anti-racist area group, anti-racist responsibility, accountability and action group, it's a combination of being able to hold this place of, wow, I'm feeling that shame. Like, it's good to feel bad as a portal of action, but look what happens to all that energy. It just sinks in and down. Whereas I feel like, oh, wait, this affects all of us. I'm not supposed to feel crappy either. I'm able to use this to mobilize my energy, hold myself in warm, positive self-regard, which is about self-esteem, which is counter to white body supremacy. I'm the same as, no better or worse than anyone. I don't need to be above or below. I don't need to be, but that humility piece of, okay, there's a prick there where the shame comes in. Instead of getting stuck in the quicksand, how am I going to then be able to move into this inquiry and know that I am grounded and connected from a deeper place, and go in and take in some of these classes and read some of these books from the left brain perspective, but allow it to penetrate my right brain and basically move from the head to the heart. And then to an embodied action around anti-racism living, which is sort of like a commitment to the mindfulness path from where I sit. If you're on the mindfulness path and you're just sitting there trying to calm the mind and chill out, then you're not actually moving into a place of being an embodied anti-racist, because it's not about your comfort, although that's fine that you can feel calm enough in order to do this work. It's about your ability to lean in. So I don't know if you want to say anything there. I was going to ask Brian if we had any questions and to see if we wanted to take any questions.
I wanted to just mention that as we were talking about, there have been many therapists, mental health people over the last 5 decades who have explored these topics, and in the coming weeks we're going to sort of highlight some of their work. But I did just want to give a quick shout out to Doctors Robin Schlenger, how do you pronounce her name? And Dr. Alana Tappan, because they do a Shame and Resilience for White People workshop that they've developed, that is addressing in some ways what you were just talking about.
Yeah. Robin Schlenger. She's she's actually a mindfulness practitioner also at New York Insight. And that's how we met doing an Undoing Whiteness class a few years ago.
And I think Dr. Alana Tappan is a clinical psychologist. So it's like people are really doing this work in the mental health field. And yet it's something that people as practitioners have to come up with and do on their own. There's very little institutional support, and it's certainly not something that they're sort of being invited into institutes or invited into, clinical psychology programs and supported financially to teach to, it's not something that's required for students to have as part of their training.
Okay. We have one question. How do therapists deal with their own fears in dealing with racism?
That's a good one. I mean, are we going to assume that this is about a white therapist?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think it's important. Okay, this is what I would say. It's important to think about it as any sort of pathology or behavior or thought pattern that you find difficult to work with, period. And I often think of the, there's some really taboo ones, like people who work with people who are perpetrators of sexual abuse, or people who work with substance abusers, or, anything where, and I'm not comparing those two things, but, there are a lot of things that make people uncomfortable for a lot of different reasons as therapists. And yet our job is to understand what the feelings are that we have and what the reactions are that we have, so that we can provide appropriate mental health care. And so I encourage people to use their own tools and do some of the work that Francesca is pointing to as a way to deal with those fears. Because I think once you're able to demystify the fears and the reactions that you have as a white person around racism, then you can really start to do important, I don't know, important's the wrong word, but like meaningful work with clients to help them with their racism. But you can't really give what you don't have. And so like, if you have a lot of fear around a particular subject, or a lot of reaction, or a lot of tension, or a lot of, I think Francesca, you would use different language, but if you have a lot of emotional arousal,
rigidity,
yeah, like around a particular issue, and racism is an issue, it's not, it is different in the sense that it is so toxic to both individuals and the society in the collective experience. But you could say that, I guess, about alcohol as well, and there are a lot of parallels there. But whatever your feelings are about a subject, like it is your responsibility as a therapist to learn how to do that. And I guess to answer the question just practically, I think exposing yourself so that to learning and trainings and the way that you would with any subject is the way to help you have less fear, because you have more knowledge, you have more understanding, you have more self-understanding. I mean, that's sort of how I think of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's Hafiz. I don't know if it's Hafiz or if it's Rumi. I don't know. I think it's Hafiz. It says, fear is the cheapest room in the house, meaning it's easy to be afraid. And it's a physiological piece. It's a physiological, our amygdala gets fired up. We have fight, flight, or freeze, or fix, or fornicate, or fawn, or whatever kinds of, defense mechanisms that we have that are very much embedded in the way our nervous system is. However, we also have this other piece of our limbic brain, which is where all the implicit beliefs are located, that meaning behavior part, that's our middle brain. But we have the neocortex, the prefrontal cortex, our executive functioning. The Homo sapiens are the ones who are aware that we're aware. And this is where a therapist can come in and sort of help and say, like you're feeling afraid. And what is that fear like in your body in terms of contraction or hyperarousal or whatever? And how is that different in a white-bodied person in terms of that feeling of being overwhelmed or unbearable or feared or afraid? How is that different from someone who's a black-bodied person in the street who's driving a car and is afraid of getting pulled over because they continue to see people with black bodies get shot and killed or suffocated and murdered? And how is your fear different from what that fear is? And then the whole conversation around what that is in terms of living in black bodies, and that sort of, racism is the pre-existing condition for COVID, right? Like that whole concept of, it's hundreds of years of what it is to have this kind of fear locked up in the body, and all of the resilience, and all of the joy, and all of the capacity, and all of that beauty. Sure, 100%. But also that piece. And so, it's, I think, pulling apart that, like, hey, can I learn to be grounded and connected enough to be with the fact that, yeah, there's fear here. And can I make space for that? I'm also watching this video right now and like, gee, that's okay. Like I automatically associate fear with bad. That's interesting. Can I just kind of be curious about fear?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or what that lives like in my body.
Yeah. And I mean, if you think about it, what you're saying is sort of like that fear is a very dissociated response for a lot of white bodied people. And I think that's very meaningful when you think about white body supremacy, because the whole one major goal of white body supremacy is to sort of teach white people that there's a way to avoid their fear, and that is to make people who don't look like them feel all of the fear. And so if you help white people feel fear around race and make the connection that like, you can tolerate this fear, and this is also fear that people think about, the fear that people are living with every day in this society. And maybe you can tolerate more of that fear, and maybe you can kind of feel more solidarity with that fear.
Yeah.
And become less, and let it become less necessary to uphold this system that requires fear from a part. It requires fear from a part of the population in order for, in addition
You
to
have
other
your
things,
comfort.
Exactly. Like that, like this discomfort that you're feeling is actually a way for you to get out of upholding this system.
Yeah, to connect,
You know,
to connect and
to
to
connect.
be right and to be a human the way that we're supposed to be. All right. Well, there's another question here. Is the therapist the racist one? Because this person has worked with racist ones.
Yeah. Well, you know, my initial reaction to that is like that people need more information about how they can report people for ethics violations. You know, like that if you have a therapist, I heard there was like there was someone on Twitter, I'm going to give you her name in a second, but she was talking about having heard from someone, I'll have to track that down, but it was basically like a therapist who had called a Black patient in the last 2 weeks to ask them for some guidance. And this is someone that they had worked with for several years, for guidance about how to deal with this current situation of like, you know, racism and police brutality.
So
and
wrong.
that's actually an ethics violation. Like that's actually like, and I guess I mean, you know, I guess I'm encouraging people to like, you know, use a structure or I mean, we need alternative structures and sort of more restorative justice practices. But I also think people can protect themselves, because that's actually, you know, or just simply saying to the therapist, that's totally inappropriate. And I'm going to reconsider working with you because this is a terrible
yeah, this isn't mine to do.
This is yeah, I mean, if you want to say to the person this is racist, yes, you can say that. Or if you want to just say like, this is inappropriate, I'm uncomfortable, you're making me uncomfortable.
Right.
You know, you can also do that. But I think it's important for people to feel empowered. And I think that's often a problem when you have a white therapist and who is like either unconsciously or kind of more sort of semi-consciously racist. Those people are very dangerous, you know, because it's completely they're not able to not do harm.
Yeah, I remember I was working, you know, at an agency, a small group practice last year, and I was the 1619 Project had just come out from the New York Times, and I was sharing it, and the very first thing that the person said to me, who's a white-bodied sort of, you know, baby boomer-esque age, was, "Oh yeah, but there's been a lot of controversy about that."
Right.
Like, or, oh yeah, there's been some questions about the legitimacy of that or something. Cause there was like, you know, one like now debunked a million times over like person who said one thing about it. But, you know, this whole idea about like chronicling the enslavement of Black people and the kidnapping and the history and the way that it went down. And the very first thing that the person says to me isn't, yeah, that was really a big piece of work, or gee, you know, a lot of effort went into that, or wow, I'm glad Black people are finally getting some attention to this matter. I mean, this went on to either win a MacArthur or a Pulitzer, but it was like, oh yeah, but that's not really. And I was just like, wow. And you are a therapist who's been working with people for decades, and that's your first reaction.
Yeah, I mean, and I think there's a lot of this reactionary feeling out there, which with therapists in particular is a bigger problem in a way, because they have this institutional power of healing.
Yeah.
And so they can't really do their job. Like you can't really do your job as a therapist if you haven't reckoned with white body supremacy. You can't do it for white clients, and you certainly can't do it for clients of color. And that's a sort of really radical statement I think, just in terms of like the way people conceptualize therapy at this time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think, we're kind of going to wind down a little bit here for today, but in terms of the protests, in terms of people who are actually like out in the streets right now, in terms of the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic and it's affecting disproportionately Indigenous and Black populations, and police brutality historically, and I'm reminded of this. It's not something I didn't know, but it's something that I'm reminded of by Dr. Michael Yellowbird on a call that we did with him yesterday about the fact that even Indigenous people per capita are killed more often by police than Black people, even Natives, even Indigenous people. That these BIPOC populations, Black, Indigenous, and people of culture, that it is a whole. There's a whole legacy there. But that, I guess my point about this is to say that given the time that we're in right now, what would you leave white-bodied therapists with in particular right now about either bringing up or talking about race in their therapy sessions, or what should they do, or what could they be open about, or what might they say? Because I'm sure it's coming up with some people, but a lot of people that I've heard who are white therapists are just saying, well, my couples are just dealing with the economic impact, or they're just dealing with their, kids being home from school. They don't want to talk about race right now. They're not there yet. It's too big. They're dealing with the immediate pressures of their own, sort of white family situation. Like, so I'm just attending to that. You know what I'm saying? Like I'm dealing with the fact that somebody lost their job or has to watch their kid, or, that kind of thing. I'm not bringing up like how they can be better allies and better.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think when I think the example that you're giving is really, really interesting, because they're already talking about a structural issue, and the structural issue is economic. And so like, theoretically or like logically speaking, like race and economics are not separate. Right. And so the therapist can make that connection, like whether the connection is, and I think how you make that connection is a little bit of it's like a really interesting technical question, because there's a lot of dissociation, like even though that's kind of obvious if you look at the facts, or the facts, of reality, the race and economics in America and everywhere really, but especially in the US, like are extremely intertwined. And so this idea that like, and also because people who are protesting are making those connections very deeply as well. So like, even, saying something like, it's really a struggle right now, isn't it? And it seems like everybody, including people who are in the streets right now, are expressing their frustration. And I hear you expressing your frustration with just like the way, how unsupported you are through this pandemic, with no childcare and no job and all this stress. And it just seems like a moment where people are expressing a lot of frustration with systems that don't support them, and making these kinds of connections that are right there on the surface that kind of, I think ultimately like are in service of kind of people's greater capacity to tolerate the world that they live in its fullness, rather than like kind of narrowing everything down to like this very individual way of looking at things, which doesn't serve people's mental health. I mean, we know that.
Right.
We know that mental health is not well served by an individualistic interpretation. People need support, they need a village.
Well, they talk about the biopsychosocial, spiritual, cultural.
Yeah. Like that we're not unaffected, like even though it seems like there's this very division, like, well, I'm white, so this doesn't affect me. That's not true. So like for the therapist to not collude with that illusion is in the service of, the patient's mental health.
Naming the structural issues, I think, is on the onus is on the therapist to make that connection and just say, wow, so there's really some huge institutional things and structural issues here that are affecting you economically. And so these policies of no maternity leave or childcare or, paid whatever it is, and health insurance for, like they're really affecting you right now, just like they're affecting people disproportionately with COVID or something that are Black and brown, or, like you can do it, I think, in a way that is like not, that is on point with what the issue is, but also isn't, and it's just widening the lens. right? But your
Yeah.
comfort level with as a therapist has to
Yeah.
be greater to be able to do that with a certain kind of facility, which means that you yourself have to be more in tune with what's really going on.
Yeah.
And you can do it in a way that isn't like thunk. Now we have to talk about
Right. I mean,
racism.
and that's the goal. That's the beauty of our field's contribution here, is because we have so many tools. I mean, so many tools. Like, how do you bring up uncomfortable things? Well, wow, like which modality do you want to choose? Because you have like a huge cornucopia of ways to have uncomfortable conversations. Yet therapists are like, I don't know how to talk about this. It's like, yes, you do.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
You know?
Yeah, we have 2 more questions and then we're going to have to close at 1. So let's see if we can dig into those, okay? The first one is, how do Black therapists talk with white patients about whiteness, racism, and accountability in their sessions? How do Black therapists talk with white patients about whiteness, racism, and accountability in their sessions? Yeah, this one is like, oh.
I mean, I think we need to do a whole show about this, because there's so many people who have talked about this, and I think we definitely need to post some resources, because I actually was going to
Go to my website.
Yeah, and I actually was gonna do a Twitter thread about this, but maybe we can just post something on your website or somewhere, because there's a great film on YouTube. It's just the trailer, but watching the trailer is great. It's called Black Psychoanalysts Speak. And it's just got, I mean, it's very rich. Like the people, it's not just about this, but it's people who are Black, who are, at most of them, I think, are in their like 40s or 50s or 60s or 70s, who've been working for decades and probably mostly with white patients. And so, you know, so there's that is one place to look. And then, but then there are other people like Kimberly Leary, Dorothy Holmes. I mean, these are just Janet Helms. I mean, these are just a few of the biggest names, like that. Ken Hardy. I mean, there's a lot of people who have written extensively and really deeply about this. I think the question of how to have that conversation now, given like where the state of like sort of anti-racist thinking, Black Lives Matter thinking, abolitionist thinking, like that, you know, there is like a fine tuning for this present moment, because like the words that this person is using about accountability, like that's, I'm not sure how much these kind of like previous, I don't know. I mean, I think Dorothy Holmes, all these people are still working today. So it's not like they're not relevant anymore. But I think there's probably newer people who I'm not even aware of who can address this even more directly. But I think we do have to do like a kind of some, you know, we could offer some like links to just be like, these are people who are talking about this stuff. And I mean, honestly, talking to other Black therapists, other therapists of color, I mean, these conversations are happening all the time. And you know, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. But I also think having permission, I mean, I think if a patient is bringing it to you, I mean, I think I can't really speak to what's going to feel right for a therapist, but I think that's something that there's a lot of resources and a lot of people have spoken really kind of helpfully about that.
Okay. Fair enough. And I guess I would just add that, like, you know, when I work with folks who are white, and, you know, I tend to work with people who are more on the side of being at the protests, or, you know, in support of the protests, even if they're white identified. And so if I'm sort of talking to them as a woman of color, then it's a conversation that includes maybe elements of sort of both sides of it, right? Because like I said, I'm multi-ethnic, so I sort of have different ways of seeing things from different perspectives. But I will say that if I had someone who I knew was a staunch conservative or something that came into my office, it would be a real question for me to address that. And so the one person that I think of when you're mentioning some of these folks is Frantz Fanon, the analyst who talked a lot about that a long time ago. And 100%. I would go back to some of his work for those who might want to look at that, because he's a shining example. And what I think is so interesting there is that he didn't just do the therapy room stuff. He found that people of color wanted to do community work. They wanted to be in group. They wanted to be doing stuff together. And that's what I've always said is this Western psychotherapy model of one-on-one is not necessarily the right model for everyone. Yes, we do storytelling. Yes, we do charlando. Yes, we do chiacchierone. Yes, we do whatever it is, where we're just sort of sitting around the tree stump and we're sort of sharing our stories. That's always been healing for people, you know, in indigenous cultures for millennia. That's never been not a thing. And there are people who are the wise elders, the indigenous folks, the shamans, the whatever that people will come to through millennia, that now there's this more specified form of psychoanalysis and, psychodynamic psychotherapy and somatic psychotherapy and all these other things, but that there's also other ways that I think that people can start to invite in different ways of doing therapy with your clients. What is it like when we take a walk in the park? What is it like when we also do a group together? What is it like when we actually engage in some kind of activity that isn't talk therapy, but includes things like art or drawing or poetry? And I think getting into these other spaces can also be a way that Black therapists and white therapists can start to engage folks, because you can start to see what the underlying sort of beliefs can be in a way that aren't just talking about it, but are just sort of like being with, that's interesting that those are the colors you used or the images that you came up. What's that about? What does that remind you of? Is that of any significance or familiarity? Or as you were doing that or drawing that or writing that, what was coming up for you there? And I just think that there's other ways of working too that aren't just directly the talk therapy piece that can be done in a therapeutic setting. Okay, last question, and then we're going to have to go. One more. What are you talking about right now is a question I've been holding on to. Do we have a responsibility as therapists to bring in issues of systemic racism and white supremacy if it is not something a client themselves brings in? Thank you for addressing and would love to hear more on this. I've been having counter-transference with clients who do not seem to think that they are affected and are talking about personal issues. Well, this is the thing, right? That we just sort of danced around, but go ahead and we can close with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another question that we could do a whole show on, because I think it's so important, because I think this is often my experience in private practice. I mean, not so much in the last couple of weeks, but certainly like the rest of the time, people are not talking about structural oppression because they're not necessarily affected by it. Or if they are affected by it, they don't see it as structural. And sometimes they make it their own fault, or sometimes they kind of, there's a lot of resistance to the idea that there's a problem with the system,
right,
because the system feels like it's working. So I guess the short version of my answer to that is I think that there is no version of mental health that I have seen that includes an avoidance of a position in a racial hierarchy that creates so much inequity that there's no way to kind of conceptualize mental health to me that that isn't going to be negatively affected by the inequity that we have in this country around race, around class, around gender, like that mental health, in the absence of a reckoning with those aspects of inequality and injustice, to me is not mental health. And
right.
I think I just don't think that's mental health. So I think that avoiding these kind of structural conversations is accepting a deficient form of mental health for people.
Right. All right.
And then I would also say how you actually have those conversations is the question.
Right. Well, we'll unpack that next time, because we're going to have to close for today. But Dr. Natasha Stovall, thank you so much. And we're going to be back Inside Out with Natasha and Francesca. We are excited that you joined us, and feel free to leave some questions in the chat for now if you want to, and we can try to get to them next time. And not sure if we're going to be doing a live show next week. We may have a recorded one, or we may skip next week and then come back in 2 weeks, but we're going to figure this out. But pretty much Wednesdays at noontime. Hope you can join us on your lunch break if you take one. And it was a pleasure seeing you all. Thank you so much to our producer, Brian Wesley Johnson at Solivity Live, and all of his support.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Francesca. Thank you, everyone. See you next time.
See you.